Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. I am here today on a fool's errand. I am going to try to predict the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction winner for 2022. This is going to comprise of books that were published in 2021 because that's how the Pulitzer Prize works. I'll get into the mechanics of it a little bit more in a second. I first want to talk about why this is so difficult to do because unlike most major literary awards, the Pulitzer Prize does not do a long list. They don't announce finalists in advance. They announce the winner, and at the same time, you find out what books were finalists. That's the way they do things. It makes it a little bit difficult because without knowing what is in the mix for the prize for sure, you kind of have to guess. And yes, you could try to predict what's going to be on a long list, but when you're predicting what's going to end up on a long list, you have more slots to try to get things right. You get one shot with the Pulitzer, and that's it. This is, I believe, the fourth time that I am doing a Pulitzer Prize prediction. Every time I've done it, I have managed to mention the ultimate winner of the prize in my predictions video. Ultimately, that's all I really care about. I know it's eventually going to happen that the Pulitzer is going to pull something completely out of left field, like with Tinkers by Paul Harding, something that nobody would see coming, and it won't be in my video, and it's going to hurt, but I know it's going to happen someday. So I'm just bracing myself for the inevitable. Maybe it will be this year. Maybe it won't. As long as the ultimate winner is one of the books that I will mention, I will be happy. I do have a firm prediction, and I have a runner-up and a spoiler contender, and then I have a lot of other options. I'm going to present the other options in no particular order when we get there. The first thing I want to explain is how the prize is awarded. So typically, there is a jury for every category of the Pulitzer, and I am only going to focus on the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, none of the other categories. So a jury is selected. We don't even know who's on the jury, because if you try to look at that information up, you won't find it. They'll probably announce who the jury is when they announce the prize. That's just another level of secrecy that the Pulitzer Prize goes in for. So the jury does all of the actual reading of the books and considering of the books, and they will select finalists. Usually in the modern era, that consists of 3 books, and they will select a winner or what they would like to recommend as a winner to the Pulitzer board. The board will then look at the finalists and the recommendation from the jury, and they will make a decision based on that. The board does not always go with what the jury recommends. For instance, the year Lonesome Dove won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, it was one of the finalists selected by the jury. However, the jury had recommended going with a book by Russell Banks. The Pulitzer board thought that Lonesome Dove was more in line with what the prize is supposed to do, and they liked it better. And there's a history of that all throughout. It's one of the other things that makes this a really unpredictable prize. There have even been years, such as 2012, when the Pulitzer board decides that they don't like the finalists that the jury presents them, or they don't like the recommended book, and they either pick something of their own, or they don't award a prize at all. That happened in 2012 when 3 finalists were presented and they didn't choose among them. It also happened when Gravity's Rainbow was deemed by the board to be obscene, and therefore rather than give the award to Gravity's Rainbow, which was what the jury recommended, they just didn't give a prize that year. They can be petty. Surprise. And while you do know some of the people who are on the Pulitzer board, for instance, author Viet Thanh Nguyen, who was a winner of the Pulitzer Prize for The Sympathizer, is on the board, you don't know who the jury is, and that makes it really difficult to guess what's going to happen in another way. So you never really know what's going to happen with the Pulitzer Prize, but here I go. I'm going to try anyway. Now, I want to mention quickly before we get started that the mandate of the Pulitzer Prize is that it is for distinguished fiction published in book form during the year by an American author, preferably dealing with American life. That's 3 different criteria: fiction, an American author, and preferably dealing with American life. And fiction is the only thing in there that stays pretty solid, but it's also pretty general. It could be any genre of fiction, it could be short stories, but being honest, genre fiction doesn't really have much of a shot here. It's pretty much always a literary fiction selection in the end. Short stories used to be really popular with the Pulitzer Prizes. They have had a bit of a drought in recent years, but I have some contenders that are short story collections that I will talk about, so we'll get through those. The American author is something that they sometimes get around a little bit because citizenship is a little hard to parse sometimes. There have been authors who immigrated to the United States. Carol Shields won a Pulitzer in 1990-something, even though she immigrated to Canada, I believe, in 1957, and she won her Pulitzer in the 90s. So it's difficult to parse through how they classify an American author. And making things even more difficult is that they have it right there. It says preferably dealing with American life, which means that it doesn't have to deal with American life. And how the jury interprets that brief changes every year. Most of the time, it does hold true in some capacity, but there are winners like The Orphan Master's Son by Adam Johnson, which is set in North Korea and doesn't really tie back to American life much at all. All of this is just to say it is not easy to predict the Pulitzer Prize, but this is the prize that is sort of my origin story with book awards. It is the book prize that I have followed the most and the closest. I am working on a project where I am trying to read every book that has won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, and it's the one that's closest to my heart. It got me interested in other awards like the Booker Prize, the Women's Prize, and all of that. But the Pulitzer is always the one that is living right here next to my heart. So we have 29 books to talk about in this video, and I had to get all of that functional groundwork out of the way, but let's go into the books. In my past Pulitzer Prize prediction videos, I have sort of held off and talked about the book that I am predicting to win later on in the video. I feel like it makes sense to open this one with my prediction. Why try to build a sense of suspense? It's The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois by Honorée Fannone Jeffers, which I just got from the library. It has a wild pedigree. It is an ALA notable title. Oh, I should mention as well that I am going to put a link to a website called the P Prize. They do Pulitzer Prize predictions as well. I love to follow this site because it's such a wild thing to try to do, and they get into it as well. You will see common titles in their list and my list, but there are a couple of books that they have on their prediction list that I'm not taking very seriously. Maybe they'll be right and I'll be wrong. I have books on my list that are not on their list. We'll see how it goes. But we are both predicting the same book, actually. So you can check their website out down below. They pointed out that the ALA notable is probably the closest you come to having a sort of precursor that is an indicator of the Pulitzer Prize, but even that is wildly inconsistent because last year's winner, The Night Watchman by Louis Erdrich, was not on the ALA notable list. There's a tendency for the ALA notable list to include the Pulitzer Prize winner, but it doesn't always happen, and it's not a great indicator because it's a list. So you kind of have to go through the list, pick out people who are probably not eligible, and then decide which one of those titles might catch the Pulitzer jury or board's imagination. So anyway, Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois is an ALA notable book. It was a New York Times Best Book of 2021. It was on the long list for the National Book Award. It was one of the Washington Post's 10 best books of last year, and it just recently won the National Book Critics Circle Award. This has probably the highest profile you can have without having already won a major literary prize already. And I can hear people crying already and saying that book prizes should be about the merit of the book themselves. Politics will always come into play. That's just the way it is. So one of the things that politics kind of represents in book prizes is if a book has won another major literary prize, it might not win another because the jury for this other prize might want to put their stamp on a book that hasn't already been a major award winner. So the fact that this hasn't won any other major literary awards probably works in its favor, but it's been mentioned as one of the best books really consistently across the board. The closest this came to winning another major literary award was that it was on the long list for the National Book Award. Ultimately, it did not make the short list. It probably also helps that Honorée Fannone Jeffers, who has been a poet before, this is her first novel, has been on the publicity circuit pretty consistently since this book came out. And she is a fantastic advocate, both for herself and for this book, and for why this book, which is a pretty hefty volume, is important. She refers to it as a kitchen table epic, the type of story that has traditionally been ignored by or maligned by publishers or by critics because it focuses on quote unquote smaller things like family and relationships and things you might discuss at the kitchen table, hence the term kitchen table epic. And she makes a really great case for why these things are important, worthy of the term epic, and worthy of critical attention. I should also mention that I am not going to spend a lot of time talking about the plots of these books. If you are interested in any of the books that I'm going to talk about, I just don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about plots on top of why they might be contenders. So I encourage you to seek out information about the book on your own, talk to independent bookstores in your area, reach out to your library. They will probably have copies. I got this from my local library. So I encourage you to check out more information. I am not going to talk too much about the plots in this video. Now, this is also a book that has a lot to say about America, about race, about family, and the ways in which history continues to resonate in the present, which makes it a really timely, urgent, relevant book. And it is also a book that very heavily deals with American life, which, as we discussed, is one of the mandates for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. It is the book that I am going to predict will win. I could very well be wrong. Sometimes the front runner doesn't even make the podium, like it doesn't even become a finalist. This could be a year where that happens. We don't always have a clear front runner, and it feels like that is Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois this year. It is a front runner, and whether or not it will pull off a victory remains to be seen. The prize right now is slated for April. There is a chance they will push it off because for the last 2 years they have because of the pandemic. They don't even have a date right now, which I think means that they are allowing themselves the flexibility to move the prize to a later date, should that be necessary. Usually it is done in April. We'll see what happens. I wanted to get my prediction out there now, and we'll see what happens with Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, I don't really want to do a runner-up. I'd rather just have a loose prediction and have a bunch of other options. But I feel like my dark horse candidate for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction this year could very well eke out a victory, and that is The Trees by Percival Everett. It has not gotten any quote-unquote precursors because, as I mentioned, it's really difficult to predict the Pulitzer, and there aren't really any good indicators. But The Trees has pretty much flown under the radar. The reason I think it has a shot is that Percival Everett was a surprise contender for the Pulitzer last year. His book, Telephone, was a finalist for the Pulitzer last year. And that might give me a false sense of confidence in his chances this year because there's a different jury this year. So history might not repeat just as easily as it could repeat. Probably more likely it won't repeat. But it feels like since he made the nomination for the Pulitzer Prize last year, his status or standing as an author has really elevated. And I might be overstating this book's odds given the fact that it has flown almost completely under the radar in the past year. It missed every major book award and critics list along the way. It's not on the ALA notable list, but it still feels like Everett is suddenly an author who is in the conversation after a long and steady career, and he is one primed for major recognition. The fact that The Trees covers really urgent and difficult topics only helps that. So we'll see what happens, but I would not be surprised if The Trees pulls off an upset when the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction is announced. Now, as I said, I didn't really want to do a runner-up, and I am not only going to break my tradition with not having a runner-up, I'm also going to have a third contender. I'm still predicting the Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, but it feels like Crossroads by Jonathan Franzen has a really strong shot to me. It hasn't gotten a whole lot of precursors, but again, indicators are really unreliable for the Pulitzer Prizes. The only thing it really got was that it was one of Washington Post's top 10 books of 2021. Now, I don't think you can ever count Franzen out for the Pulitzer. He has been in the conversation with every book that he has published since the corrections. Maybe not so much for Purity. People didn't really take that book all that seriously. But he, as an author, is somebody who pretty much has to be considered. The P Prize site has him in 13th place, but I think Crossroads represents a really serious shot at the prize for Jonathan Franzen. It feels like he has been a sort of contentious and divisive figure in literature, also since the corrections was published. Crossroads feels like the book that could get over that. First of all, because people like it. I've seen a lot of people who even don't like Jonathan Franzen say that they gave it a chance and really liked it. It also probably helps that Jonathan Franzen has been a really quiet presence on the publicity circuit this year, sort of the opposite of Honorée Fannone Jeffers. The fact that he has been relatively quiet since this book was published probably helps him. He has a way of putting his foot in his mouth when he has a microphone, and he hasn't really done that over the last year. I'd say it's a serious threat. I have had 2 aborted attempts to read a Jonathan Franzen book. I didn't finish The Corrections, and I didn't finish Freedom either, and I haven't felt any need to read any of his other books or revisit those 2 books. So the only thing that would really get me to pick up Crossroads is if it does win the Pulitzer, because, as I said, I'm trying to read every book that wins the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And I wouldn't be happy about it, but I have heard good things about this book, so we'll see. Now, I'm going to talk about the rest of the books in no particular order, as I said. The next book I want to talk about is The Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. This has quite a pedigree, unlike The Trees and Crossroads. It was a finalist for the Booker Prize. It was longlisted for the Carnegie Medal. It was on the long list for the Women's Prize, and it has been talked about a lot. Now, the biggest potential mark against The Great Circle is that other major book awards have already put their stamp on this book. There are fingerprints all over it. And I've mixed metaphors, but I don't care. I'm just going to go with it. You know what I'm talking about. If the board of the Pulitzer is at all worried about standing out, that might make The Great Circle a tough sell for them. Still, it has a lot of other marks that a winner has, and it does feel like a very American story, but on a global scale. It did miss the ALA notable list, which potentially leaves its chances a bit cloudy. Pun kind of intended. But we'll see. Again, the book that won the Pulitzer Prize last year wasn't on the ALA notable list. And although this does feel like other book prizes have gotten their fingers on it, maybe the Pulitzer will be the one that comes through for it, because it hasn't won any major book awards yet. And this is kind of its last chance, too. The next book we have to talk about is Matrix by Lauren Groff, which was an ALA notable title, was a National Book Award finalist, and was on the shortlist for the Carnegie Medal. Like The Great Circle, I would say this is a potential spoiler. Lauren Groff feels like an author who is bound to win a Pulitzer Prize for fiction at some point, but given that the prize is intended to award a book that preferably deals with American life, there's a bit of a question mark about whether or not she can win for a novel that is set before the United States even existed. Authors have won for books that don't deal with American life all that closely. Again, The Orphan Master's Son is a sort of classic example and a recent example as well. But it doesn't quite happen enough that it's commonplace. It feels safer to assume that the Pulitzer jury or the Pulitzer board is going to wait to see what Lauren Groff comes out with next, because she's an author who's always going to be in the conversation, and her next book might more specifically deal with American life or be closer to the brief of the Pulitzer Prize. Or maybe they won't care and they'll give it to the Matrix anyway. We will find out. The next book is Afterparties by Anthony Veasna. So this is another book I'm classifying as a potential spoiler. It was on the ALA notable list, and it was on the long list for the Carnegie Medal. This feels like a book that flew under the radar for the most part last year, but it's been popping up in my corner of BookTube or the internet a lot recently. And it's not unheard of for a Pulitzer Prize to be awarded posthumously. Both James Agee and John Kennedy Toole won their awards after they died. But to be fair, it is a rare thing to achieve. If Afterparties wins, it will join those ranks, because Anthony Veasna died before it was published, and he was young. A lot of people considered him an up-and-coming author. So winning the Pulitzer Prize could be a way of rewarding the promise that he had, and I've heard really good things about the book as well. So it's not like it would just be a prize for an author who was unfortunately lost too early. It is also a short story collection, and it's been a while since a short story won. It has been a decade since a short story won this prize. A Visit from the Goon Squad was the last short story collection to win a Pulitzer. Short story collections traditionally have a hard go of it in major literary awards, and there are a lot of people who don't like short stories. The Pulitzer is an award that used to not be afraid to award a story collection, but it seems like it's happening less over time. I don't think you have enough data to say that they've moved away from story collections, which means this has a chance. But it does feel as if the conversation is shifting away from short stories. So that might make this a tough sell as well. However, if Afterparties makes the list of finalists that is submitted to the Pulitzer board, it feels like it could pull off an upset. The question is if it will make the list of finalists. The next book might be a bit of wishful thinking on my part. It is The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. This was a finalist for the National Book Award, and that is pretty much all the attention that this book ended up catching last year. I loved this book so much when I read it in early 2021 that I declared it an early prediction for the Pulitzer. Well, unfortunately for The Prophets, a whole lot of not much happened after that. This feels like it has the same trajectory as On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, which seemed like it had all the makings of a winner of the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, and then for some reason, perhaps divisive response, which happened to On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous and also happened to this, it just couldn't hold the spotlight and failed to land on any major awards or critics list for the year. It could still pop up, but it feels like a big long shot at this point. So I'm not going to call this a potential spoiler. I'm going to call it a lovable long shot, and we'll see what happens with it. I'd be happy if it did get some attention from a major literary prize, but it doesn't seem likely at this point. Next, let's talk about Zorrie by Laird Hunt, which I'm going to classify as a potential spoiler. Its big claim to fame is that it was a finalist for the National Book Award, and it did kind of feel like it had a path to potentially win there. It ultimately did not. One thing that's interesting, because it's really difficult to predict what a jury for the Pulitzer Prize is going to react to, but there are some common threads among winners. And Zorrie has the kind of spare prose and quintessentially American focus that the Pulitzer can be really susceptible to. That, I think, gives it great odds to be at least a finalist this year. And any book that gets in front of the Pulitzer board has a chance at winning. It's also a great book. I would highly recommend it if you haven't read it, and it's small. The next book feels like it has strong chances at winning, so I'm going to call it a strong contender for the prize. It's Intimacies by Kitamura. This was on the long list for the National Book Award. It was also one of the New York Times best books of 2021. It's also been popping up a lot in my corner of BookTube or the internet recently. It seems like it has a lot of fans, and a lot of people are continuing to talk about this book into this year. But for the most part, last year, it felt like it was flying under the radar until it landed on the long list for the National Book Award. And it did not make the ALA notable list, but I don't think this is a title that you can count out. And again, the book that won the prize last year was not on the ALA notable list either. So I think Intimacies has a strong shot at pulling off a surprise upset. Now let's talk about the book that won the National Book Award for fiction last year, Hell of a Book by Jason Mott. It was an ALA notable title, and like I said, it won the National Book Award for fiction last year. Historically, the National Book Award for fiction and the Pulitzer don't line up. Since the National Book Award launched as we know it in 1950, they have only aligned 8 times. And a 9th time, the National Book Award went to Gravity's Rainbow, but as I mentioned, the board for the Pulitzer decided not to award a prize that year rather than give a Pulitzer to Gravity's Rainbow, which the jury had recommended they do. So technically, they've aligned 9 times, but there are only 8 official times that they have lined up. That doesn't bode well for Hell of a Book, but I don't think you can count it out. And just because it hasn't happened a lot doesn't mean it can't happen again. The next book feels like a total left field selection, but the P-Prize site also has it on their list. I'll explain. It's The Netanyahus, an account of a minor and ultimately even negligible episode in the history of a very famous family by Joshua Cohen. This was on the New York Times 100 notable list, but I didn't even notice it on that. I'm going to call it a lovable long shot. The hardest thing about predicting the Pulitzer is that sometimes the award goes to a relatively obscure choice. So how do you identify which relatively obscure book has a shot against the heavy hitters? Well, the Pulitzer sometimes likes quirky comedies that play with familiar forms, which means they could be enamored of this book, which blends fiction and nonfiction and plays with the form of the campus novel. The publisher's website describes it as, quote, a wildly inventive, genre-bending comedy of blending identity and politics that finds Joshua Cohen at the height of his powers, end quote. That sounds like it could be pretty good for the Pulitzer. I'm still calling it a long shot. And I admit, I hadn't even heard of this book until I saw it on the P Prize site. But when I looked into it, it does start to feel like a total left field choice that the Pulitzer could actually go for. Next, I'm going to go out on a limb with a story collection again and talk about Gordo by Jaime Cortez. This was on the ALA notable list, and it was a long-listed title for the Carnegie Medal. I'm going to call this a potential spoiler, but even among the potential spoilers, it feels like a bit of a lovable long shot. Again, the Pulitzer sometimes likes quirky, humorous books. Sometimes it loves story collections, and sometimes it loves serious issues books that shine a light on uncomfortable aspects of America's past. Gordo would tick all three of those boxes, if it can manage to get on the jury's shortlist, that is. But remember, it's been a decade since a short story collection won. And this might feel a little too quirky, but then you could have said the same thing about Less by Andrew Sean Greer, which emerged victorious when the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction was announced a couple of years ago. Up next, we have The Five Wounds by Kirstin Valdez Quade. This was on the ALA notable list and on the shortlist for the Carnegie Medal. I'm calling it a lovable long shot. The Five Wounds has some of the qualities of a surprise winner for the Pulitzer, but it feels like a bit of a long shot compared to some of the other possibilities. Like Gordo, it has a sense of humor, and also like Gordo, it shines a light on a population not typically seen in literary awards. It also has the same pedigree as Gordo, but for some reason, I just don't see it as something that is as likely to pull off an upset as Gordo. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. I would be interested in reading this book. I have not so far. It existed to me only as a cover for a while, but then once I found out more about the book through the ALA notable list, which I'll put my reaction to that down below as well if you'd like to check that out, it caught my eye, and I would be interested in getting to it at some point. Next, we have The Wrong End of the Telescope by Rabih Alameddine. This was on the ALA notable list, and it was a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Prize. I'm going to call it a potential spoiler. I'm tempted to call this a lovable long shot, but it has all of the trappings of an under-the-radar finalist for the Pulitzer. And again, anything that gets submitted to the board has a shot at winning, no matter what the jury's recommendation is. And there's no denying that a book about a transgender doctor working with refugees could feel particularly urgent, given current events. It still feels like a long shot, but I won't be surprised if it turns out that this book made the final three once the Pulitzer Prize is announced. I am going to be returning it to the library. I had started it, and because of current events, I just didn't manage to get through it, but that's a whole other story. It is something I'm really interested in reading. I only made it about 70 pages in, and I was enjoying it so far, and I would love to finish it at some point. The next book is another hefty one. It's The Lincoln Highway by Amor Towles. I'm going to call it a lovable long shot. The main recommendation for this book is that Towles has previously published two other books that have been well received and well liked by both critics and audiences: Rules of Civility and A Gentleman in Moscow. That is a profile that the Pulitzer Board likes to reward. They love an author who has published one or two or three or several books that have been well received before but kind of flown under the radar. But it feels like they would be just as likely to wait for Amor Towles' next book. So who knows? I'm going to call it a long shot. I'm also going to be giving the designation of lovable long shot to Infinite Country by Patricia Engel, which is much slimmer than Lincoln Highway for whatever good that is. This was a long-listed title for the Carnegie Medal. It does not have the crowded pedigree of, say, the love songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, but here's a quick blurb that shows why this slim volume could surprise everyone by winning. Quote, "An urgent and lyrical novel about a Colombian family fractured by deportation, offering an intimate perspective on an experience that so many have endured and are enduring right now." End quote. Can it pull it off? Only time will tell, but feels like it could be a contender. The next book is The Sweetness of Water by Nathan Harris, which was longlisted for the Booker Prize and longlisted for the Carnegie Medal. However, I'm going to call it a lovable long shot. Aside from its brief moment in the spotlight when it made that Booker long list, it feels like The Sweetness of Water flew completely under the radar last year. Given that, it's hard to consider that it has good odds at winning a Pulitzer. But again, this is an award that has a way of going with surprise choices. And there have definitely been Pulitzer winners that have had a lower profile than The Sweetness of Water. So it has a shot. Next, let's talk about How Beautiful We Were by Mbalo Mbue, which was one of the New York Times best books of 2021, and it is a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award. I'm going to call it a potential spoiler. Here are some things in Mbue's favor. This book was well liked. This book is topical. And both of those things were also true about Mbue's last novel, which was Behold the Dreamers. Think of what I said about Amor Towles, how the thing that makes him a likely spoiler for the Pulitzer is that he has published books previously that people liked. Behold the Dreamers was a pretty universally well-liked book, and it feels like the same is true of How Beautiful We Were. Now, technically, it's set in Africa, or at least mostly, according to the blurb. But Mbue immigrated to the United States, and this feels like the level of not actually being a specifically American story that the board might be willing to overlook that part of the mandate. But that's an inexact science, so who knows? The next book I want to talk about is Wayward by Dana Spiata. I don't know if I pronounced that last name correctly. Forgive me if I got it wrong. It was one of the New York Times 100 notable books from last year. I'm going to call it a lovable long shot. Sometimes the Pulitzer takes on issues-driven novels, and sometimes it likes a comical look at life as we live it in our present. If this year's jury is feeling the latter, they could turn to Wayward, an amusing book about a middle-aged woman that is, quote, about aging, about the female body, and about female difficulty, female complexity in the age of Trump, end quote. It would be a surprise win, but it would also make sense in a certain light. Then we have My Year Abroad by Chang-Rae Lee. This was on the New York Times 100 notable list, and I'll link my reaction video to the 100 notable list down below as well. Chang-Rae Lee was a finalist for the Pulitzer in 2011 for his novel The Surrendered, so he's been in this conversation before, and his 1994 novel, Native Speaker, is considered by some to be a modern classic. While he's still not the most known author on this list, that kind of gives him a solid foundation that the Pulitzer board may notice. Think of what I've said about Amor Towles and Mbalo Mbue. They may also like that My Year Abroad is, quote, an exploration of the surprising effects of cultural immersion on a young American in Asia, on a Chinese man in America, and on an unlikely couple hiding out in the suburbs, end quote. That fits the brief for the Pulitzer, while also looking at global sociopolitical complexities. They might like that. Next, I feel like I have to talk about this book, and I don't want to. It's No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. That is not a pun on the title. That is me reflecting my actual opinion of this book. It was a Booker Prize finalist, one of the New York Times best books of 2021. It was on the shortlist for the Women's Prize. I'm going to say it has strong chances, but that does pain me a little bit. All I can say to the Pulitzer board is this. Please don't do this to me. I will hate you. I will hate you if I have to try to read this book again. I didn't like it, in case you can't tell. So please, don't do that to me. But I'm going to say it has strong chances. Here's another book I hadn't heard of until I started putting this list together. The War for Gloria by Atticus Lish. This was on the 100 notable list from the New York Times, but I completely overlooked it on that list. I'm going to call it a lovable long shot. I saw this on the P Prize site and looked it up. The more I looked into it, the more it seemed like a book that maybe I should include on the list. Atticus Lish is a PEN/Faulkner winner for what that's worth, and sometimes the Pulitzer likes to choose something more obscure, as I've said. So while I still think this is a long shot, I'm not sure you can count this book out, especially since it deals with both a complicated family, which is a Pulitzer Prize mainstay, and the enormous costs of healthcare in this country, which makes it timely and urgent, something that the Pulitzer frequently likes to reward. We'll see. Now, before I get into potential repeat authors, I want to talk about two authors that are kind of like Chang-Rae Lee, people who have been in the mix before and maybe don't have great chances this year, but if this year's Pulitzer jury and Pulitzer board are looking to reward people who have been in the mix before, they could be serious contenders. The first one I want to talk about is The Other You, Stories by Joyce Carol Oates. I'm going to call this a lovable long shot. But anytime Joyce Carol Oates publishes a book, her name has to be considered as in contention for the Pulitzer. And she publishes at least one book pretty much every year and has been doing that for a while. She's an American literary legend who has been a finalist for this prize 5 times. 5 times without winning. She's basically the Pulitzer Prize's Susan Lucci. And eventually, Susan Lucci won her Emmy. Still, it doesn't feel like The Other You had much of a footprint this past year. And given that Oates has another book coming out this year called The Babysitter, it feels like she has another chance coming already. And that's the danger of being as prolific as Joyce Carol Oates. It feels like there's always another chance to give her the prize in the pipeline, even at her age. And while The Babysitter feels like it could be more serious for a Pulitzer jury, The Other You is a story collection, and Oates is considered a master of the short story form. But once again, it's been a decade since a story collection won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. So even though that is the field most people think of her as a master, it might just as easily be the thing that ultimately works against her. We'll have to wait and see. And then there's Foregone by Russell Banks. I'm going to call this one a lovable long shot too. So speaking of people who have been contenders for the prize before, Russell Banks had been a finalist twice, but not since 1998. The trouble is that Banks seems like less of a contender than Oates, and like The Other You, Foregone doesn't have much of a footprint. But the pedigree and the subject matter, it's about a dying filmmaker who agrees to a final interview setting off a story about, quote, memory, betrayal, love, and the faint grace note of redemption, end quote. That seems to make this a good candidate for a potential under-the-radar winner. We'll have to see. Now I'm going to talk about a couple of possible repeat authors, people who have won a Pulitzer Prize before but published a book in the last year that could put them in contention for the prize once again. Like I said earlier, I know people hate to acknowledge that these prizes are not only decided on merit, like which book is the best, but it is what it is. Things like politics or a desire to spread the wealth absolutely come into play with juries for awards of all stripes, not just the Pulitzer Prize. So here's a little bit of reality. Since the first fiction prize was awarded in 1918, only 4 authors have ever won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for fiction. It's that rare. Even Toni Morrison only ever won a single Pulitzer Prize for fiction. So the following authors and books are in the running, sure, but each one has a steep hill to climb in order to get across the finish line simply because the author has already won before. And again, it is what it is. I don't make the rules. Of the potential repeat winners for this year, you got to talk about Colson Whitehead first and Harlem Shuffle. I'm going to call it a lovable long shot. So here's the thing. Harlem Shuffle appears very high on the prediction list from the P-Prize site based on the book's success with critics groups, but I'm a little more skeptical. And again, it's extremely rare to win 2 Pulitzer Prizes for fiction. Only 4 people have done it, and Colson Whitehead is already one of them. Winning 3 prizes has never been done before. That means there's a particularly steep uphill battle for this book, which is also stylistically different from his last 2 novels, which won Pulitzer Prizes, Underground Railroad and The Nickel Boys. Those felt like urgent stories about important topics, and while Harlem Shuffle is shining a light on a time and a setting that is little seen in literary fiction, it doesn't feel as hefty as both of those books. Still, there's always a chance. Colson Whitehead already defeated the odds against becoming a 2-time winner. Maybe he'll be the first 3-time winner. It feels unlikely, though. Next, let's talk about the book that I'm actually currently listening to on audio. It's The Sentence by Louise Erdrich. This was on the long list for the Carnegie Medal. I'm going to call it a lovable long shot. The P-Prize site also has The Sentence really high on its prediction list. Harlem Shuffle is running in 2nd place on their list, and The Sentence is 3rd. But once again, I'm more skeptical than they are because it's extremely rare for someone to win 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and none of those 4 2-time winners have done it in consecutive years, which would be the case for Erdrich, who won last year for her novel, The Night Watchman. She would be the first ever back-to-back Pulitzer Prize winner if she pulled off a 2nd win. The Sentence is a pretty well-liked book, but it feels like she would have had a better shot for this book if she hadn't already won last year for The Night Watchman. Erdrich is an author who absolutely could have 2 Pulitzer Prizes for fiction. I would have given them to her for Love Medicine and Plague of Doves, but there are already people, myself included, grumbling that her win last year was a career achievement prize rather than a comment on the merit of the Night Watchman, which means that people might not be in the mood to reward her again. And yes, The Sentence is not one of the ALA notable titles from this past year, but neither was the Night Watchman, and we saw what happened there. Then we have Bewilderment by Richard Powers, which was a finalist for the Booker Prize, felt like a strong contender for the win for the Booker Prize, and was also longlisted for the National Book Award. I'm still calling it a lovable long shot. I'm calling all of these lovable long shots because, again, it just is really hard to win 2 Pulitzers. And as I said, the P Prize site has Harlem Shuffle in the 2nd position and The Sentence in 3rd, and wouldn't you know it, Richard Powers is the book that they have coming in 4th place as a potential winner for the Pulitzer Prize this year. And again, I think they're overestimating the odds for a previous winner, but who knows? I think I also underestimated Powers' odds at winning when he won for the Overstories. So maybe I'm making the same mistake by calling him a long shot for Bewilderment. It just feels like after being a Booker Prize finalist and on the long list for the National Book Award, Bewilderment has already been all over the place. But it didn't win in either of those places, so maybe there's a shot after all. Again, if the board can get over the fact that Powers has already won and recently. We have 2 more books that I want to talk about in this video, and the next one is Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. It was one of the ALA notable books from last year. It was a finalist for the National Book Award, and it was on the long list for the Carnegie Medal. Again, I'm calling all of these potential repeat books a lovable long shot. Now, Doerr was a sure thing when he won for All the Light We Cannot See. He was in the position Honorée Fannone Jeffers is in right now, except I feel like it felt even more inevitable that All the Light We Cannot See was going to win back then. His odds this year are a lot murkier, and not just because it's so difficult to win a 2nd Pulitzer Prize for fiction, but because Cloud Cuckoo Land is not the type of book that usually wins this prize. Despite the way it flirts with genre conventions, there's no denying that this was a favorite book of 2021 for a lot of people, which means it will definitely at least be in the conversation. To what level remains to be seen. The final book I want to talk about in this predictions video is O. William by Elizabeth Strout. And again, like all of the other potential repeat winners, I'm going to call it a lovable long shot. Of all the previous winners, this one feels like the biggest long shot, but then I wouldn't have predicted that Strout would have won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction for Olive Kitteridge in the first place. So there's a history of me underestimating her books here. Who knows? I could be wrong again. And while O. William feels like the previous winner with the lowest profile, Strout has leveraged her Pulitzer win to develop a sizable fan base. If one of those fans is on the jury, don't count her out. So that's a lot of information. That's a lot of predictions, a lot of potential contenders that I've talked about for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction this year. Again, the book I am predicting is The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. I think The Trees by Percival Everett has a really strong chance at being a sort of underdog, come from behind winner. And I don't think we can count out Crossroads by Jonathan Franzen. Those are the 3 books that I would say are the heaviest hitters. I'm counting on The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, and all of these other books that I've mentioned could be in the mix. I would love to hear what you think. If you think any of these books have a shot at the Pulitzer, let me know in the comment section down below. If you think I have completely overlooked something that has a shot, please let me know in the comment section down below. I know you probably won't be shy. And as always, I really appreciate your time. I know this is a longer video. It just is by the very makeup of it. So thank you if you have made it to this point, and thank you if you follow along. And if you're new, I hope you enjoyed this enough to follow along in the future. I will be talking about the winner of the Pulitzer Prize for fiction whenever it is announced. Again, it is scheduled for April, but we'll see what happens with the prize. It was delayed for the last 2 years. Hopefully this year they will be able to keep to the traditional schedule. We'll see. Again, thank you for your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.